Hello again. It's been a while. It's been 20 minutes. So, very warm welcome to you. You are the most senior cybersecurity official we have at Disrupt this year. We're absolutely thrilled to have you. You're the assistant director at CISA, at Homeland Security, the new consolidated cybersecurity agency that's been around for about a year now.
That's correct.
How's that year been?
It's been pretty good. Not sure how many people know about our agency, but we are specifically designed to work with the private sector to defend against the most sophisticated threats of our country.
So what kind of threats have you seen, the threat landscape over the last year? How's that changed?
Well, it often depends on what you're talking about.
Yeah.
A lot of times when we're in the...
Because there's a lot that you work on. There's
there
an
is a
awful
lot that we work on. Sort of at a high level, what we focus on is, on one hand, we're very involved in protecting federal networks. So everything from, if you think about the database that houses everybody's social security numbers, which a lot of people need to have access to our immigration systems, to your, school financial aid forms. There's a lot of information that the government holds. So we do a lot of work with that, all the way to critical infrastructure. So, trying to prevent nation states from getting into our election systems, our electricity, our financial systems. And so it's a broad sort of swath that we cover. The biggest thing that I'm really proud of that we accomplished over the last year is we released something called the National Critical Functions. And this was really important because in cybersecurity, especially in DC, which is sort of a unique place that has unique conversations about technology and cybersecurity, and it can get very broad. And over the years, what we really started to realize is we needed to define what it was we're actually defending. And so it's not sort of a specific industry necessarily, which was the big shift, and elections really taught us this, is when you have an adversary that's seeking to undermine a confidence in our democratic institutions, they're in some ways they're doing that through trying to traditional hacking, but then there's a lot of other ways that an adversaries try to accomplish their goals. And so coming up with these national critical functions, which is public, and covers everything from thinking about how are we trying to defend the internet ecosystem and to broader areas.
So you mentioned the nation-state threats that the US faces. You've got Russia, North Korea, Iran, China. What does it mean to build better cyber defenses against nation-state attacks?
I think that there is an element of building the actual technology defenses, and that's important. And when you think about a lot of these institutions that are the targets of some of these nation states, some of them have a fair amount of resources at their disposal. Many of them do not. Many of them are run by state and local organizations, and so they are often the least able to procure a lot of these, sort of sexy cybersecurity technologies that people like to talk about. So there is a component of how do we work with the market to build more secure solutions, particularly in industrial control systems. It's a space that we work in a lot. But then there's also, and really what we've learned over the last couple of years in particular, it's also about building a more resilient and aware public. Much of our institutions are built on trust, and adversaries have learned how that they can manipulate that trust in those institutions. So it's not just sort of a technology thing that we have to approach. It's really these sort of broader trust issues, and importantly from the federal government, how do we get information out into the public, but also how do we get it to those who own those systems, who can do something about the threat.
So you have quite a senior job. You have an agency doing a lot of work. Most people have a 9-to-5 job. I don't. I cover cybersecurity. It's never ending. Some people go home and have a beer, and I don't get to do that. For you, is it ever quiet, or is it just like drinking from a fire hose?
It's relative. I've been doing this now a really long time. I was in the Army for several years, and I've been with the department for a little over a decade. And so I think what I've sort of forced myself at least to do is you're in this for the long haul, and there is always something going on. There is always a breach. There's always reporters that are reporting on things that you have to deal with.
Those pesky reporters.
and so there's always something going on. I think what's really important, I have an amazing team of several hundred people that we do have 24/7 operations, and it's about putting the trust in the team. It's recognizing that every day can't be that sort of most urgent fire hose. You got to save it for when things are really bad.
So, you've been in government for, over a decade, and so, the US government has a bit of a skills shortage, and the private industry is, pays more, national security clearance takes a while. Is it a national security risk that the US government struggles in places to compete with private industry?
I would say it's broader. It's a national security risk that we don't have the talent, regardless of government or the private sector. We don't have enough. There's a lot of people that talk about the tech shortage overall, but particular to security, it suffers even more, and we have a massive shortage that we are actually expecting that will grow larger. So we actually spend a lot of time investing in even K through 12 curriculum. We have a scholarship program that we put in place, and I think we're trying to change the way that people think about working with the government too. A lot of times historically people think, you go to the government, and then you've got 30 years, and then you have your retirement paycheck. That's fine. That's great if people want to do that. But I also recognize that there's people that I'll pay for a scholarship. They come work for us for 3 to 5 years. We train them. They're awesome. But then they go and they work in the private sector for a few years, and maybe after their kids are done with college, they can come back and work for us. And but I think some people refer to that in a negative way. I think it builds a community of people of a shared sort of experience. They understand what it's like on the government side. They understand what it's like in the private sector. And in security, we're really all trying to do kind of the same things. And so that's the culture. And we actually will be debuting in the next year an entirely new workforce program that's really modeled after how tech companies recruit and retain individuals. And so we're really trying to change the nature overall of getting people more into security overall, but also particularly encourage them to work for us, even if it's only for a couple years.
Yeah. So CISA does a lot to warn businesses about the emerging threats. Some have complained that they're not getting the intelligence that they need. What can the government do more to protect private businesses?
So I would say, first of all, private businesses, there is an accountability. They need to be responsible for protecting themselves. Oftentimes, we do a lot of incident response, and we see a lot of people that weren't doing really some of the basics. And oftentimes, it's because they didn't think that they had anything of value that somebody would be after. They didn't really think about the fact that they have a business relationship with, maybe they weren't the end target, maybe they were just the stage to get to the ultimate target, or they don't think about the fact that their product is collecting a lot of private information that a criminal could monetize, or a nation state could even collect. So that's kind of part of it, and we're really trying to. And I don't know. A lot of people are aware, but this is National Cyber Awareness Month. Is October, so consider yourself all aware. And but one of the things we're trying to really focus on, particularly in October, is raising the level of public awareness. Everybody now interacts with the internet or computer or network system in some way. So how can you be accountable for that? How do you act as a responsible consumer, as an online citizen in your business? And so in terms of that, I think it's very important. And I also think a lot of people think cybersecurity can be fixed by better and more intelligence. Intelligence is not going to solve any security problem, much less cybersecurity. And a lot of it, we'd like to see, more market solutions, more automation, more orchestration of capabilities that are at a price point that, more organizations can afford. And I think the government has an opportunity to sort of push some of that, more standards. We do need to get more intelligence out. I will say we need to do better on that. When we have intelligence, we need to get it to organizations. And importantly, it needs to be in a way that they can do something with it. It can't be just, hey, here, here's this IP address, it's bad. It needs to be, here's what's going on, here's what we understand, and that's often very hard for government to release that information.
So what can improve that intelligence sharing relationship? It goes both ways.
It does.
You've got companies like Facebook who have complained historically that, in the run-up to the 2016 election, they weren't getting enough information. And it does go both ways. So how can the government proactively try to improve that relationship?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a few things, and those are valid complaints, and we've spent a lot of time. A lot of what we do is we're the point for sharing that information, even if we're not the ones that originally collected it. And what we found is that you'll have, and you heard from the former director of NSA, you'll have the NSA, you'll have other intelligence community people, and they have a piece of the puzzle. But where we sort of see ourselves is that's one part of it, but it's missing context. And we're doing a bunch of work with the banks right now and talking about these national critical functions, and understanding how the wholesale payment system works. And you're talking about the trillions of dollars that banks are clearing every day. That's something that an adversary would probably want to disrupt or degrade, or even just give the perception that they're doing that. So it's not so much about, and the government needs to have that understanding of how those systems work in a way that, in a level of depth, that you can then turn to the collectors and say, hey, can you tell me if you've got anybody looking to collect against this type of software that they're using, as an example. That then would be useful information. That would then be a potential indicator or warning that somebody is trying to do something. In the case of foreign influence, when you're talking about with Facebook, we need to, there's potential, information that is often some of the most sensitive information, and so we have to break down a lot of those barriers of, and we have to think about the private sector as a partner in intelligence sharing, which is a big shift for the government.
So 2 years ago, it was widely reported that the NSA mistakenly let go of its prized hacking tools, which were used to launch and spread the WannaCry ransomware attack, which I think most people are quite aware of that happening. It's quite a damaging event. So what is the US doing to prevent another public WannaCry style attack?
Well, I don't know that we could ever prevent something like that. When you just have something that completely manifests itself as a worm, and kind of even I think the original perpetrators of that didn't expect probably that sort of impact. What we do want to prevent, and there's a lot of things on the preparedness and prevention that we have already talked about in terms of, frankly, updating your patches, some of those kind of basic things that would have prevented a fair amount of people from being a victim of that. But I also think it's important to build more resilience in our systems. We talk a lot about mitigating the consequences. So acknowledge that these bad things are going to happen, but how can we be better prepared to work together? So for WannaCry, and I've talked about those a little bit, but not a lot of people really, I think, understand the years of work that have gone in building global alliances. I run the United States CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team. Most countries have sort of a version of that. And when WannaCry started in Asia, we were getting information from our partners in Asia about what was going on. They were passing information over to us, and when in the Brits and in Europe, they were, so that in the U.S. for really that kind of entire first half of the day, we were getting advanced information because of those partnerships we had built overseas, and those national certs were getting information from their local businesses who were being attacked, and Luckily there was an enterprising individual who was able to find a way to kill it, and didn't impact the U.S. as much. But what we really recognized is that we needed to have those sorts of mechanisms, but much more robust in the United States, to think about like how do you mobilize industry and government and allies to combat something like this as it's emerging. And so since then we've been building more of those plans. We have a lot of representatives from companies that sit on our floor with us, and we work through these things together, so that if we have these sorts of scenarios come up, that we're ready to respond quickly, even if we didn't prevent it.
So the companies in this room, the startups and large businesses alike, have one thing in common, and that's that they very much rely on the supply chain, which is something I know, CISA is obviously very, involved in. It's where businesses get their technologies from, their services, hardware, software. What kind of threats do you see, against the global supply chain? And of course, it's a difficult question. Every supply chain is different, but what kind of threats do you see?
Well, there's a lot of different threats. You see a lot of foreign governments that are sort of finding clever ways to mask their influence in investments, and in finding ways to maneuver around the ways that the government traditionally can have some ability to block investments that we're concerned about. I would say the best advice I could give would be how we thought about Kaspersky. And for many years, there was a lot of conversation about should we use it, should we not? And I was very frustrated because, and this gets to the intelligence thing too, is a lot of people want intelligence to just give them this is the right answer, and that's usually not what you're going to get. And so what we decided with Kaspersky is that we were not comfortable with government data being housed in a country where whether a company wanted to or not could be required to hand that data over to the security service. And so we have the authority to actually direct federal agencies to take action. And we decided to do it publicly for due process reasons. We wanted anybody who would be potentially impacted by this decision to remove Kaspersky. And our thinking was, and I would encourage anybody when you're thinking about your supply chain, whether that's from a software, hardware, or just business relationship perspective, sort of three things, and that we think about and will continue to think about from a broad national policy is the first is like the laws of the country. And I know that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily want to talk about, but the laws of the country where either the data is housed or transited, or where the company operates, it's important to consider. And if there's not that judicial review and a company can be compelled, you want to maybe consider, is that a place where I want my data to be held? But that can't be the only thing that you consider, because that's not the economy we live in, and I don't think it makes sense just to sort of suddenly ban all things just because it comes from one country. So we try to be a little bit more nuanced, and because the second thing was really to think about what sort of access does that piece of, in this case, software have. An antivirus, there's a fair amount of access that it has to your computer and your data, and so that really is that second part. And then the last part, and this is more from a national perspective, is what's the market penetration? Something gets the first two, but it's not something that's widely used in the U.S. Then that's probably not something we're going to get fired up about.
So we only have a little bit of time left. My final question is it truly possible to secure the supply chain, and how much should government do? How much should private businesses take responsibility for it?
I don't think it's possible to 100% secure anything. So we talk a lot about risk management, and we see ourselves as risk advisors and risk managers. I think everybody has to be a risk manager in your own organization. You have to understand what's most important, and you have just understand the risk that you're taking on if you acquire a company, if you join, have investment from certain individuals or organizations, understand what that risk actually is, but then make the decisions based off of your own risk calculus. And that's how I think of the broader supply chain is, a lot of people talking about 5G and all the challenges there. And we have to think about it from a national perspective. Is in many cases we've outsourced the manufacturing of certain components of our communication systems outside of this country, and that's the economics of where we are, and we can't spin that around on a dime. So we have to think about how do we create more trust in transparency in our supply chain, and again, I would say supply chain broadly, meaning IT products and services, so that's really what more transparency, so that anybody can make that risk decision, and more broadly at that national level, really having that understanding of where we can't accept risk, and where, frankly, there's areas where you have to accept risk.
Sadly, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much. Cheers.